The sound of laughter at a funeral is usually considered a sin, but for Evelyn Sterling, it was the sound of a long-awaited victory. As the mahogany casket of billionaire Arthur Sterling was lowered into the rain-soaked earth, his widow didn't shed a single tear. Instead, she leaned over to the young man standing in the back row, a man she had spent 20 years belittling, and whispered loud enough for the front 3 rows to hear. "You get nothing," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying sort of joy. "You were a mistake when you were born, and you are a ghost now that he is gone. Go back to the gutter where your mother found you, because by tomorrow, you won't even have a place to sleep." The young man, Leo, simply adjusted his worn tie and looked her in the eye. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, and he didn't cry. He simply waited. He knew something Evelyn didn't. He knew that in the world of the ultra-wealthy, the loudest person in the room is rarely the one holding the keys. To understand how a funeral for one of the country's most powerful tech moguls turned into a scene of such public cruelty, you have to understand the history of the Sterling Empire. Arthur Sterling was a man who built a $250 million fortune from nothing. He was ruthless in business but complicated in his private life. 25 years ago, before the fame and the private jets, Arthur had a brief, passionate relationship with a woman named Sarah, a humble librarian who saw the heart behind the ambition. But as Arthur's star began to rise, the pressures of high society and the allure of a strategic marriage took hold. Under pressure from his board of directors and his own soaring ego, Arthur left Sarah to marry Evelyn, the daughter of a rival shipping magnate. What Arthur didn't know at the time was that Sarah was pregnant. When Leo was born, he was labeled the Sterling mistake. Evelyn made sure of it. She spent years using her influence to keep Sarah and Leo in the shadows, ensuring they lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city while she presided over a 30-room mansion. Arthur, plagued by guilt but controlled by a prenuptial agreement that gave Evelyn's family significant power over his early ventures, provided for them in secret. He paid for Leo's education and sent monthly checks, but he never gave Leo his name. To the world, Evelyn's 2 biological children, the spoiled and reckless Julian and the vapid, cruel Claire, were the only heirs to the Sterling throne. Throughout Leo's childhood, Evelyn treated him like a recurring infection that needed to be eradicated. On the rare occasions Arthur insisted on seeing his son, Evelyn would make it a point to invite them to the mansion only to humiliate them. She would seat them in the kitchen with the staff, referring to Leo as the help in training. She told her own children that Leo was a parasite, a living reminder of their father's lapse in judgment. Julian and Claire took their mother's lead, once throwing Leo into the freezing garden pool during a winter gala just to see if the mistake could swim. Through it all, Leo's mother, Sarah, taught him one thing: dignity cannot be taken, it can only be surrendered. As Arthur grew older and his health began to fail, the battle for his $250 million fortune became an all-out war. Evelyn moved to isolate him, firing staff members who were loyal to him and replacing them with her own cousins and cronies. She restricted his phone calls and eventually moved him to a private wing of the estate where even Leo was barred from entering. For the last 2 years of his father's life, Leo only saw him through a heavy glass window, Arthur's hand pressed against the pane, his eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken message. When the news finally broke that Arthur Sterling had passed away from a sudden heart attack, Evelyn didn't mourn. She went shopping for black diamonds. The morning after the funeral, the atmosphere in the Sterling library was thick with tension and the smell of expensive cigars. Evelyn sat at the head of the massive oak table, flanked by Julian and Claire. Julian was already scrolling through luxury car listings on his phone, while Claire was arguing with a travel agent about a private villa in the Maldives. They were the image of entitled arrogance, convinced that the world was finally theirs for the taking. Leo stood by the door, still wearing the same cheap suit from the day before. He looked out of place among the gilded frames and leather-bound books, a reminder of a past Evelyn was desperate to erase. The family lawyer, a gray-haired man named Mr. Henderson who had served Arthur for 40 years, walked into the room with a heavy briefcase. He looked exhausted, his eyes lingering on Leo with a strange mix of pity and respect. Evelyn tapped her long, manicured nails on the table. "Let's get on with it, Henderson," she snapped. "We have a lot of work to do. The charity foundations need to be defunded, and I want the guest house leveled by Monday. It's an eyesore." Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and opened a thick folder. "Before I read the final will and testament of Arthur Sterling, I must inform you all that there were several codicils added in the final months of his life. These were filed privately and held in a secure trust outside of the Sterling Corporation's standard legal oversight." Evelyn scoffed. "It doesn't matter. The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. 50% of all assets go to me, and the rest is split between my children. That's the law." The lawyer didn't look up. "Actually, Mrs. Sterling, the prenuptial agreement you signed 30 years ago had a very specific clause regarding the dissolution of the marriage upon death. It stated that your share of the estate was contingent upon the absence of a direct blood heir who could prove a continuous and meaningful relationship with the deceased, should such an heir be recognized by the patriarch himself." The room went silent. Evelyn's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about? He has 2 heirs sitting right here." Mr. Henderson pulled out a DNA profile and a series of notarized documents. In the last year of his life, Arthur Sterling legally recognized Leo as his firstborn son and primary heir. He spent those months documenting every visit, every letter, and every secret conversation the two of them had. He also recorded hours of video testimony explaining the coercion he faced from you, Evelyn, to keep his son at a distance. Claire stopped talking to her travel agent. Julian put his phone down. Evelyn's face turned a ghostly shade of white. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I controlled his every move. He couldn't have met with a lawyer without me knowing." "The mistake you made, Evelyn," Leo said quietly from the doorway, his voice calm and steady, "was assuming the staff you hired were more loyal to your money than they were to my father's kindness. The nurses you thought were your spies were actually helping him record those videos every night while you were out at your galas." Mr. Henderson began to read the will, and with every sentence, the world Evelyn had built began to crumble. "To my wife, Evelyn, I leave the sum of $1, the lawyer read. "Your history of emotional abuse and your attempts to isolate me in my final days have been thoroughly documented and provided to the district attorney's office for investigation into elder abuse. You are hereby stripped of your position on the board, and you have 24 hours to vacate the Sterling estate." Evelyn jumped to her feet, screaming. "This is a lie. I'll sue. I'll burn this whole company to the ground." Mr. Henderson ignored her and continued. "To my children, Julian and Claire, I leave a trust fund of $50,000 each, provided they enroll in and complete a 4-year degree at a public university and maintain a full-time job. Should they fail to do so, the funds will be donated to the Sarah Sterling Foundation for Single Mothers." Julian looked like he was about to vomit. $50,000? That won't even cover the insurance on my Ferrari. And finally, the lawyer said, looking directly at Leo, "To my son, Leo Sterling, I leave the remaining 98% of my estate, including all real estate holdings, the Sterling Tech majority shares, and the $250 million in liquid assets. Arthur's final note to you, Leo, is as follows: to my bravest son, who I called a mistake only to protect him from the sharks I lived with. You were the only thing I ever did right. Use this to build the world we talked about." The silence that followed was deafening. Evelyn collapsed back into her chair, her eyes wide with shock. The woman who had laughed at a funeral was now trembling in the face of her own ruin. She looked at Leo, hoping to see a glimmer of the boy she used to bully, someone she could manipulate or threaten. But Leo wasn't a boy anymore. He was the owner of everything she had ever coveted. Leo walked over to the table and picked up the keys to the estate that Mr. Henderson had placed there. He looked at Evelyn, not with hatred, but with a profound sense of closure. "You told me yesterday that I was a ghost," Leo said. "But it turns out, you were the one living in a house that didn't belong to you. My father didn't just leave me money. He left me the truth. And the truth is, you never loved him. You loved the shadow he cast. Now, the sun has moved, and you're standing in the dark." Evelyn tried to speak, her voice cracking. "Leo, please. I raised you, in a way. We are family. You can't just throw us out." "I'm not throwing you out," Leo replied. "I'm simply following the instructions of the man you claim to love. You have 24 hours. I suggest you start packing." "And Evelyn? Don't touch the silver. It's been in the family since before you arrived, and it stays with the Sterling name." Over the next few weeks, the fall of Evelyn Sterling became the talk of the town. Without the Sterling fortune to back her, her high society friends vanished like smoke. Creditors began to circle, as it was revealed that she had taken out massive personal loans against the estate that she no longer owned. Julian and Claire, forced to face a reality where they actually had to work, quickly spiraled. Julian was last seen working at a high-end car dealership, not as a buyer, but as a junior salesman who had to wash the cars he once drove. Claire's social media following plummeted when she could no longer afford the luxury lifestyle she had built her brand on. Leo, on the other hand, didn't move into the mansion right away. His first act as the head of the Sterling Empire was to renovate the small apartment complex where his mother had raised him, turning it into a state-of-the-art housing facility for struggling families. He renamed the company Sterling & Son, but the son he referred to wasn't just himself, it was a promise to every child who had been told they were a mistake. He eventually did return to the mansion, but not to live in luxury. He turned the 30-room estate into the headquarters for the Sarah Sterling Foundation. The library where Evelyn had once plotted her dominance was now a place where children from the inner city came to learn about technology and business. Leo kept one room for himself, the small office where his father had spent his final days. One afternoon, while sorting through his father's old desk, Leo found a small, handwritten note tucked inside a hidden compartment. It was dated the day before Arthur passed away. It read, "Leo, if you are reading this, it means the plan worked. Money is a tool, not a throne. I spent my life building a throne and found it very cold. I hope you use the tool to build something warm. I am sorry it took me so long to stand up for you. I hope the $250 million is enough of an apology to start with. With love, Dad." Leo sat in the quiet office, the sun streaming through the windows, and for the first time since the funeral, he let out a long, shaky breath. He wasn't the mistake. The mistake was the greed and the cruelty that had nearly consumed his family. But as he looked out over the gardens where he had once been pushed into the ice-cold water, he saw children playing and teachers laughing. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been transformed. The fortune that was meant to be a weapon in Evelyn's hands had become a gift in Leo's. As he walked out of the office to join his mother for lunch in the garden, he realized that the best part of the $250 million wasn't the mansions or the jets. It was the fact that for the first time in his life, when people said the name Sterling, they didn't think of a mistake. They thought of a second chance. Evelyn, meanwhile, lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, the very same neighborhood where Sarah had raised Leo. Every morning, she would walk to the corner store, passing by the sleek, black cars that belonged to the Sterling Foundation. Sometimes, she would see Leo's face on the news, talking about his latest philanthropic venture. People would whisper about how kind he was, how he was a true visionary like his father, but better. She would clutch her thin coat against the wind, remembering the day at the funeral when she had laughed. She realized now that her laughter hadn't been a sign of victory, but the final gasp of a dying era. She had tried to bury Leo, but she had forgotten that he was a seed. And in the fertile ground of his father's hidden love and his mother's unwavering strength, the mistake had grown into something far more powerful than she could ever understand. The fortune was gone, the status was a memory, and the woman who wanted everything was left with nothing but the echoes of her own cruelty. In the end, the $250 million didn't go to the wife, the socialites, or the legal heirs. It went to the one person who knew that the true value of a man isn't found in his bank account, but in the legacy of the lives he touches. Leo Sterling was no longer a ghost, he was the future. And as he looked at the thriving community he had built, he knew his father was finally resting in peace, knowing that the empire was finally in the right hands. The story of the Sterling mistake became a legend in the city, a cautionary tale for the greedy and a beacon of hope for the overlooked. It reminded everyone that karma doesn't always arrive on time, but when it does, it brings the whole bill. And for those who have been told they get nothing, sometimes, if they hold on long enough, they end up with everything. Years later, Leo stood on the balcony of the foundation, looking out over the city skyline. His mother, Sarah, stood beside him, her hair silver but her eyes as bright as ever. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Leo asked, looking at the Sterling name glowing atop the skyscraper in the distance. Sarah smiled and squeezed his hand. "He was proud of you long before the money, Leo. He was proud of the boy who didn't let bitterness turn his heart to stone. That's the real fortune." And as the sun set over the city, casting a golden light over the legacy of a man once called a mistake, it was clear that the $250 million was just the beginning. The real story was about a son who found his father, a father who found his courage, and a woman who learned that in the end, you truly do reap what you sow. The laughter at the funeral had long since faded, replaced by the steady, quiet pulse of a life well lived and a fortune well spent. Justice had been done, and for the first time, the Sterling name stood for something beautiful.